Okay, now we're ready to go.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Yevgenia Albats. I'm running here in Journal Center. I'm a distinguished journalist in residence for 2020 to 2023. I'm running this series of interviews and conversation with Yevgenia Albats. This is my last one. And I am so happy to introduce to you my good friend, a great journalist, David Hoffman of the Washington Post. David, welcome.
Thank you.
David and I, we know each other since Moscow when David was the Moscow bureau chief, and he wrote a book that became basically the textbook on Russian politics in the 1990s, which is called The Oligarchs. It's a huge volume which got a hell of a lot of different prizes. But basically, if you want to know anything about what was going in Moscow in 1990s, you have to. It's a must to read book. There's another book that I have it in Moscow both in English and in Russian. It's the book called The $1 Billion Spy. It is the book that's about David is going to talk about this himself. It has a subtitle, True Story of Cold War Espionage and Betrayal. Absolutely amazing story of Moscow and Soviet Union in 1970s and early 80s. I remember this life, but even barely. But I was reading with huge interest because I could recognize places and certain, and it was the time when KGB basically was running the country as much as it is done now, but yes, again, it's we Russians will love to do this circles.
State within a state, I think somebody called it.
Yeah.
That was
Yes.
Yevgenia's classic book about the
Yeah.
KGB.
Anyway, but the latest book, also, David got a Pulitzer for the book, which is called The Dead Hand, the Untold Story of the Cold War Arms Race and Its Dangerous Legacy. And finally, his latest book is Give Me Liberty, the true story of Oswaldo Paya and his daring quest for a free Cuba.
And I'll talk about this later.
Yes. So this is very
Forget my
interesting
cover.
that David switched from, I'm a little bit jealous, of course, because I as all of us, I'm very Soviet Union centric. But anyway, but Cuba is
It's a satellite.
yes, it was. Anyway, so David, thank you very much for doing this. Thank you very much for coming. David, now he's if you read editorials in Washington Post, that you should. Quite often, David is the author of those editorials now. And he used, of course, to be, here on the international desk, the national desk, and all kind of possible desks. David, you've been in journalism forever.
I've been to Washington Post 41 years.
41 years.
I covered Reagan's 1980 campaign. And sometimes people look at me and they say, did you know Eisenhower too?
Did you?
No.
Unbelievable. But now, I titled this conversation "Killing the Messenger," because for you and me, and for us in our line of work, what is happening in Moscow now is a real tragic history, as Vladimir Kara-Murza, our colleague and opposition politician, and the guy who was running this Magnitsky List campaign, yesterday, he was sentenced to 25 years in the maximum security prison for nothing. Even, efforts being accused.
For speaking the truth.
Right, but, right.
That's something.
Right. But also, and today, our another colleague, Evan Gershkovich, or his mom calls him Vanya. Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal correspondent in Moscow, the bureau chief of Wall Street Journal in Moscow since 2022, and before then he was working for for France Press, and before then for Moscow Times. Yesterday he appealed his case. Today he appealed his case in court. Of course, he was denied, but it was the first time that we saw Evan sort of alive and well. Sasha, if you don't mind, let's show this, that's the first one is, yes, that's Evan Gershkovich. So the amount journalists shot the in, but the students are close. Well, Vladimir Kara-Murza yesterday, they didn't allow anyone in any normal people, any audience in the courtroom. There were, students of the Faculty of Law present, and 40 ambassadors who came to hear the verdict were not allowed in. They had to watch this kangaroo court via the video. There were very short video which was made by a colleague of ours, Steven Rosenberg, who is still in Moscow. He's a BBC correspondent. Amazing, absolutely, he's an amazing guy.
Vladimir Kara-Murza, handcuffed and in a bulletproof cage, one of President Putin's most prominent critics. Vladimir Kara-Murza faced multiple charges, including treason. The verdict, guilty. The punishment, a quarter of a century in prison. Access to the courtroom was heavily restricted. With other journalists and with foreign diplomats, we crowded into another room to watch on TV screens. For more than a decade, Vladimir Kara-Murza has been a high-profile opponent of the Kremlin. He'd lobbied Western governments to sanction Russian officials for corruption and human rights abuses. And he publicly condemned the war in Ukraine. Mr. Kara-Murza is also a British citizen.
The British government will continue to support him and stand in solidarity with him and his family, and we will continue to call for his release.
For a critic of the Kremlin, a political opponent of President Putin, a prison sentence of 25 years is unprecedented in its severity. And it's a sign that in today's Russia, the authorities are determined not only to silence all criticism, but to neutralise anyone and anything they believe could be a threat to the political system here.
That 25-year prison sentence,
That's
I think this is, well, to me, this is the recognition of the effectiveness of Vladimir's work. They hate him so much, and they're so much afraid of him out there, running free, that they need to lock him up for a quarter of a century to stop him from continuing his work.
Another sign of the times in Moscow. This famous museum reminds Russians of political repression of the past. It's named after
that's the last presentation in Sakharov Museum, which got closed. Yesterday there was the last presentation, and Moscow authorities didn't allow to run Sakharov Foundation this building anymore, so it's all closed. So you worked in Moscow, David. You wrote a lot about Russian politics. Tell me, what's going on? Why did they go after messages? What's the point of giving 25 years to Kara-Murza and jailing them?
So, Yevgenia, again, thanks for having me here. It's really terrific. I took a day off from work to do this. For me, this is holiday. Thanks. These are two slightly different cases, and I think it's important that we think about how to respond, to understand why they're slightly different. So I was the Moscow correspondent for the Washington Post, and when I went to Russia, I went to the foreign ministry and I applied for and got an accreditation card, a press card, a very important card that is respected by every traffic cop with his hand out. And, it's a formal permission from the government to do journalism. You obviously agree to honor the laws of the country and the rules that are set down by the foreign ministry in doing that kind of journalism. And also, when correspondents from Russia came to the United States, they too had to be accredited, and we also gave them a card and said, here's our rules. The rules are not symmetrical, the societies were not symmetrical, but still we had a long-standing understanding of working in each other's countries that went all the way through the Cold War. And the Washington Post had correspondents in Moscow in the darkest days of the Cold War, and the rules were the rules, and you knew the rules. Sometimes you might stretch the rules a little bit, and sometimes, or actually very often, the rules were just not enforced. But that agreement was bedrock. And, you know, at times the Soviet authorities would try to manipulate correspondence. A couple were expelled or denied visas to return and so on. But it was still within a set of rules. No correspondent I mean, there were acts of violence occasionally. Paul Klebnikov comes to mind.
He was killed.
It was killed by probably somebody that was not the Russian state, maybe somebody else, maybe a private actor. But my point is that Evan, who I don't know, but was following in the footsteps of this long tradition. He had a press card. He had an agreement from the Russian government. He could come and do basic journalism, just like Russian government correspondents work in Washington, D.C. right now. And by grabbing him, I believe probably randomly, I don't think they spent a lot of time focusing on him personally. I think they needed somebody, and they needed somebody as a hostage. They needed somebody to trade for a future person they wanted to trade. So frankly, the person who was maybe easiest to get was somebody who was out reporting, maybe somebody who was younger, somebody who was accessible, and somebody who would perhaps trigger a big reaction in the United States. And I want to get at something here. It's very important to realize Evan was committing journalism. That is not treason. It is not a crime. He was following the rules set by the Russian government when they gave him that card. So whenever you hear the charge of treason, that is just an excuse. I think the real thing that happened here is that Putin and his security services decided they want to get somebody back who committed a crime or has been arrested in the United States. And this is simple, barbaric hostage taking. It's against the rules that Russia set for itself. It's just breaking the rules and saying there are no more rules. We're going to grab a human being and put them in this jail, and then we're going to try and negotiate with you to get somebody back. And I'm sorry, but many of us who, for example, lived through the age of hostage taking by terrorists, I don't know how many of you remember what happened during the time when Americans were taken hostage in Iran, when they were taken hostage in Lebanon. We've all been through this period. It's a really barbaric, uncivilized, evil practice of playing really a kind of a game with people's lives. That's what happened to Evan. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, but actually he was in the right place because he had a press card. He was allowed to be, he was permitted to be doing this, and they broke the rules. So I think his value to Putin is going to be not in any kind of trial or make any kind of point about journalism or treason. It's going to be in negotiating a trade. And in this case, there's a danger here for an open society. Because in an open society, we discuss things openly, including this case. His parents, who I'm sure are heartsick about this, have opened up their living room. They've provided his letters. There's a lot of talk about what a great guy he is. And he certainly seems to be somebody who really was enthusiastic about discovering Russia. All of this spills out into public view. This is exactly what Putin wants. Because for a trade, he needs to drive up the price. So the more we make Evan seem like so dear that we have to have him back, the higher the price is going to go up. And this creates pressure on President Biden to make a trade. And that's the kind of silent negotiation that's already beginning. If you doubt me, go back and read what happened with Brittany Griner. She was also taken hostage for absolutely no reason and held for 10 months and eventually traded for somebody of very high value.
I'm sorry, David, I think that,
Can I just finish one thing?
Yeah.
Before we go too far in talking about him as a person and as a journalist, we should not forget in every comment and at every turn to point out that he has been taken hostage, that this is not about him or who he is or his work. It's about the guys who took him, breaking all of their own rules and turning him into hostages, which is what terrorists do. I think the slight importance of how we regard him is that if we simply focus on the fact that he's a star, we're going to prolong this process because we're going to make the price so high that nobody will be able to meet it. And Putin will say, I want that guy in Germany who committed murder in the Tiergarten. Let's trade for him. He was an FSB assassin. Should we trade an assassin for an honest reporter? That's the kind of conflict we're going to face. We have to speak up for Evan. We have to keep the case front, but we should always remember to emphasize this is hostage taking. This is wrong. It broke Russia's own rules. Sorry.
You said that, with Brittany Griner, at least, they found gashish oil in her luggage.
2 ounces that was for medical
This
purpose.
is Russia. This is Russia. And, they use this article on drug selling, in order to put anyone in jail. So no, there is zero tolerance towards drugs. So at least, no, of course, she was not supposed to get this 8 years in jail, but at least on paper, she violated the Russian criminal code. And even though we absolutely, she was, that Brittany Griner, she's a famous NBA player, but she also played for the Russian team in Yekaterinburg, by the way, the same city where Evan was arrested. So she was time and again, she was going back and forth. And she, of course, she carried this gashish oil all the time because she had, all kind of traumas, and they were using this gashish oil in order, to deal with the pain. So obviously, Russian guys, they knew that she was carrying this. But at least on paper, there was something. With Evan, first, she informed Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation that he was going on assignment to Yekaterinburg. He wrote a paper in which he acknowledged that he was going to go to Nizhny Tagil to interview people in Uralvagonzavod. He was there with a photo guy. When he came to the city, once again, he submitted all the paperwork to the local authorities.
He followed the rules.
He followed the rules. Precisely, that's my point.
Yeah.
So
So
Putin's press,
taking them hostages.
yes, Putin's press said that Evan Gershkovich was caught red-handed.
It's a lie.
Of course, it's a lie. But just tell me, what's the logic? I can tell you, when they took Evan, I thought, okay, Evan just, a couple of months before that, Evan participated. Wall Street Journal ran a great series of articles on the Putin's inner circle. And I thought that maybe the reason they chose Evan precisely because obviously he managed to interview some high-profile figures from the Putin's entourage. Is it possible that that was the reason? Look, there was Steve Rosenberg, you saw, who did this piece on, Steve. All of us know Steve. Steve was there forever. He's married to a Russian woman, and
Plays the piano.
Plays piano, and he's a great guy. But he why so there should be this, or you don't think there is any logic in why they grabbed Evan?
The logic is they needed a high-profile person to drive the price up that would create an emotional reaction in the United States. They did not want a British hostage.
Mhm.
They could have taken Valerie Hopkins too, who's British, but they didn't take, God forbid. They looked for somebody. Yes, they needed an American who they thought would create a big outrage so they could then bargain. And that's what's going to happen next, but it could take a while. And that's a really terrible thing. If somebody grabbed you off the street and hustled you away and made up lies about why, and you were stuck in jail, it's a tragedy. But don't lose sight of what's really happening here, and allow Putin to just turn this back on the poor reporter. It's on Putin. Now, let's talk about Kara-Murza. It's
Okay.
why I started out by saying it's different. So Vladimir Kara-Murza, first you have to understand, is the son of a famous journalist from the period that Yevgenia and I both remember very well. For he was a journalist on NTV, the most honest and reform-minded of the television at the time. Also, very soft-spoken guy, very modest guy. But Vladimir grew up and is named after his father because the environment was sort of, at least in that very early period after the Soviet collapse, when people were really, including Yevgenia, were pioneering about how to be real journalists, how to be, what is honest journalism, and founding New Times, Echo Moskvy, NTV. So first of all, remember that this Vladimir himself had some of these ideals from a very early age. He studied at Cambridge, he studied history, and became very, very fascinated with the story of the Soviet dissidents, made a wonderful film about them, especially about the famous moment on Red Square at the time of the Prague Spring, when 7 dissidents unfurled a banner and were immediately arrested. The point is that he didn't really start out to be a journalist like his father, but he certainly started out with these ideals and with the hope that Russia had opened up both its past and its present to the kind of journalism that we could all admire. Later, he became a journalist in Washington for quite some time. But in a funny way, as a young man, Vladimir Kara-Murza was not just a Johnny One-Note. He actually was somebody who's capable of doing a bunch of different things at once. And he got more and more interested in being more politically active, inspired by several things. One was that one day he came under the spell of the very charismatic Boris Nemtsov, the former governor of Nizhny Novgorod, who had become a deputy prime minister and then led opposition to Putin. And for many of us was one of the sort of hopeful leaders of the post-Yeltsin period who never really made it, but still he was a serious opposition leader. And starting from the time he was 18 years old, Vladimir Kara-Murza was hanging out with Boris Nemtsov and learning the ways of opposition. So he was drifting more toward politics. He was also working as a television reporter in Washington. And I think also became enamored with the idea that we could do more in the Putin era to stop human rights abuses and to punish people that were responsible for them with the passage of this law called the Magnitsky Act. Vladimir was very significantly involved in a campaign to get this bill passed, first in the US Congress and then elsewhere. Now it's passed in 38 countries. The law was a complete break from everything that had been done about human rights up until that time. Up until then, human rights had been principles that politicians and diplomats talked about in terms of countries and their records. But individuals in those countries who committed abuses were not punished. The Magnitsky Act essentially said we will start to punish by sanctioning, by freezing assets, denying entry to individuals who commit these crimes. And Magnitsky, as many of you probably know, was an accountant and lawyer for Western investor Bill Browder. He was hauled off to a prison for no reason, just like Evan. He eventually died in that prison, and this law was named after him to punish those who beat him in prison until he died. And the law allows the United States to simply name people who are accused of carrying out such terrible abuses, and it's now grown to hundreds of names and is now global. It's used around the world to at least try and bring some accountability. Well, this law had an odd reaction in Russia. There were some low-level people, let's say maybe people in prison, wardens and so on, who never really planned to go to Disneyland, and they didn't have a bank account at Bank of America. That it probably was never going to affect them to get sanctioned. But at the higher levels, the Magnitsky Act landed like a thunderclap. But as Vladimir Kara-Murza's wife Yevgenia said to me yesterday, she said, it really matters because they steal in Russia and they hide their stealings in the West. And for a lot of high-level people, having your assets frozen, in other words, the money you stole, or being denied a chance to go to Florida to own a condo there, that's a big deal. And so this law began to really irritate people in the elite, especially the oligarch level, and maybe this second level of oligarchs in Moscow. That was 10 years ago. Vladimir was deeply associated with getting the bill passed. He argued for it. And one day he, as a reporter, showed up at the Russian embassy for a press conference in Washington. And he was an accredited journalist and they refused to let him in. And he realized that the reason was the order had come down from the top, that because of his work on the Magnitsky Act, he would no longer be allowed into the embassy. And this pushed him more to become less, to go more into politics. And he plunged ever more deeply into politics. As I said, it's not a simple case. He was a journalist and a political activist, and he had worked for Nemtsov. He's a Russian politician. And also he just cared passionately about the future of the country and could see the backsliding that was happening under Putin's, really backsliding that picked up speed after 2011 and 2012 in that fraudulent parliamentary election. So Vladimir Kara-Murza's arrest when he arrived back in Moscow last year in April is revenge. It's revenge for his involvement in the Magnitsky Act passage, something that Putin has never gotten out of his craw, and all those people around him who can no longer put their money in the United States and are kind of pissed off that, you know, their plans for cheap little hidden vacations have been disrupted because other countries are passing the Magnitsky laws. They can't go anywhere anymore. And, you know, this sentencing yesterday of 25 years in prison is cold, hard revenge. And I think we should realize that in this case, Putin probably is not interested in a trade because he wants Vladimir Kara-Murza to be a symbol that he can hoist up on a lamppost. He wants somebody he can use to create fear for others who might protest, who might speak out. Kara-Murza was eloquent in opposing the invasion of Ukraine. He was eloquent in stopping the thievery in Russia and the kleptocracy. So he was an interesting person who was a historian, politician, journalist, and a charismatic speaker. Kara-Murza was able to get a crowd on their feet, you know, enthusiastic. He could really bring people along. And although he was very young, I think, like Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Putin saw, here is a guy who's not afraid of me, and I'm going to teach him a lesson. So I do think we should speak out for Vladimir Kara-Murza. I think his values are values everybody can share for the future of Russia. But we should also realize it's going to be harder to make a deal here because it's not about hostage taking. It's about punishment.
Two questions here. So one, just to add to your point, the judge who sentenced Vladimir to 25 years in the maximum security prison is on the Magnitsky
Is sanctioned, yes,
He is
for
sanctioned.
his previous
So
activity.
talking about, the judicial, right? But
I said revenge. That's what I'm talking about.
yes. But 25 years, I know that, in the United States, you're sort of accustomed. I was to Green Haven, to the maximum security prison in upstate New York, and there, you talk to people and they say, 25 to life, 40 to life, 60 to life, natural life. So, but in Russia, as you're well aware, 25 years, the last time when we had this sentence, it was under Stalin. Even under Brezhnev, the biggest sentence was 15 years. For political prisoners, for dissidents, 7 years, it was wow.
Or 8, right?
Yes, Stus, famous Ukrainian poet and political prisoner in 1936. He was more than 15 years, but that's, I think, that was one of these rare cases. but 25 years,
Unheard of.
that was Stalinist type of sentence. Why?
Teach people a lesson, to make a point,
25 years for nothing.
create
Listen,
fear,
it was be refused to run the case.
to create fear.
You know, Vladimir was convicted of treason. However, each and every speech that they regarded as treason, he made public. He himself put these speeches on the website. So wait a second, it's even from anyone who read this verdict would say, but that's why they made this all the hearings secretive. So who is the addressee of this message 25 years? Russians, or it is something is directed to the world public opinion? He was a columnist with the Washington Post, to people like you. What do you think?
Putin has created a lot of ways to stay in power. But what this tells us is the one thing that really still frightens him is our people who could challenge his legitimacy. And, he can have all the armored cars, secret dachas, military and security services in the world, but he doesn't own people's minds. And he knows that. And this was a guy like Alexei Navalny who could motivate people and raise the question of Putin's illegitimacy, because he is not legitimate. And I think also who could challenge, like Navalny, the secrets of the Putin regime, the hidden wealth. I think this is if you have to ask me, the big indicator is swinging over on this case. The gas gauge has moved over. Why? It's Putin himself. He's afraid. He's afraid of this guy. And that doesn't happen very often. As you know, Yevgenia, there are millions of people today, and there were in Soviet times, who can see a dysfunctional regime, who can sense things are not right. We don't have the opportunity to speak. We don't have, the government is not providing the basic benefits. The system's not working. But out of millions, only very few are willing to stand up, face the totalitarian wall, and speak the truth. And to be honest with you, even as people today ponder how to react to Putin, many people are intimidated by the idea that if you call the special military operation a war, or if you hold up a blank sheet of paper in a protest, or if your 10-year-old daughter makes a drawing that's critical of the military, that you could go to prison for a few years. Vladimir Kara-Murza was not afraid. And Andrei Sakharov, bless him, was one of the few who was not afraid. He came from inside the system, father of the hydrogen bomb, and he stood up to it. And this fellow who I'd like to talk to you about later, who was the subject of this book, was also exactly that way, stood up to Fidel Castro. So I look at this case and say, we shouldn't look to Vladimir Kara-Murza for the explanation here. We know what he's for. What we're seeing revealed is Putin's fear. And frankly, the Putin regime, I think, is weak. It's weakening. It's gradually running out of its strength. He made a horrible error, costly, devastating error for the people of Ukraine, but also a devastating error for himself. This war is going to bring him down.
Before we go into this war, one last question regarding, Kara-Murza and Gershkovich. You said that Evan is taken in order to have, this exchange fund for, he's a hostage, but, Putin probably will be willing to trade Evan, for some spies who were recently arrested in Slovenia. There are a couple of illegals, I believe, in somewhere in Brussels, the group guy, also an illegal, and there are a couple of people here. But you said that it's not the case with respect to Kara-Murza. But wait a second, unless Americans are going to try to get Navalny and Kara-Murza out, they're going to die there. listen, with Navalny, there is just awful what's going on with him, just as we speak. So, did I get you right that you think that it's that we shouldn't hope that United States is going to exchange Navalny and Kara-Murza along with Gershkovich and will, or that it's not going to happen like it happened with Bukovsky, for instance, the famous Soviet time dissident, or what like Alexander Ginsburg, the famous also Soviet time dissident.
So this is a tricky question. I want to be really clear. I do think that Gershkovich was taken as a hostage for trading, and definitely not because of anything he did. In Vladimir Kara-Murza's case, he's a political prisoner. He did speak the truth, and it wasn't tolerated. And I think the United States should attempt to negotiate a trade, but it's going to be harder because he's a different kind of prisoner. And Navalny also, it's going to be harder. It's not impossible, but we shouldn't lose sight of what Putin's motives are. I'm guessing, nobody told me for sure, but I'm guessing that there's a slight different motive in these cases. Gershkovich didn't give speeches against the war and talk about the Putin regime. He was a journalist doing his job. And so that's all. I think not all of these horrible sort of tragic developments in what's happening in the destruction of modern Russia, not all of these things are easily remediable by us, by the United States pushing or pulling a string. We shouldn't just think, oh, we'll negotiate a hostage deal and everything will be better. To be honest with you, every hostage deal, including Brittany Griner's, confirms to Putin that it works, and it puts a big target on the back of the next person.
Right, but he's a terrorist. Listen,
What?
Putin is a terrorist.
That's right. He is a state terrorist. He has the power of coercion in his hands. But I don't think we should get our expectations up that this is simply about negotiating trades. It's about bigger things. It's really about the future of Russia. And we haven't even talked about that yet, but that's what's at stake. We're right before us now. Nobody really wants to have a public discussion, but we are on the cusp of another great spinning of the wheel about Russia's future. And I'm not really sure where it's going to come out. It's not only about Ukraine, it's also about Russia and Belarus. And I think we should elevate this. I am friends with and care about these people that are taken, and I share their values and sympathize with them. But I think Americans should not oversimplify that we can just press a button and cause change here. It's much, much more difficult.
David, you were in Moscow, and you were covering Russia, during this amazing 10 years of Russian freedom. And probably, all of us, Russians, were going to recall this decade as probably one of the best in our lifetime.
Not only that, this was the freest 10 years in 1,000 years of Russian history.
Right. I would say, since the last years of perestroika, to be honest with you.
Well, let's combine them. Let's say the last years of perestroika and
Yeah.
the Yeltsin 10 years were the freest period in Russian history.
What did go so wrong? You probably thought about that.
Every day. No, really, I wrote 3 books about Russia, and I think every day, having spent so many years going there, I also worked on the film called Putin's Revenge for PBS Frontline. I was the chief reporter for that film.
I remember you.
And I think I was associated myself with my writing and my thinking with the idea of a new Russia. In fact, that was the subtitle of one of my books, The Oligarchs, Wealth and Power in the New Russia. And the new Russia is being destroyed before our very eyes. So what went wrong? I think the biggest turning point in that history that I can put my finger on tangibly now was a simple choice that Boris Yeltsin made, and that was picking Vladimir Putin. It is one thing that we don't know enough about as historians. Yeltsin handpicked a successor who destroyed Yeltsin's own legacy. really destroyed modern Russia and is destroying it today. And, I've heard the stories that Yeltsin did it because he thought Putin would be, protect the family, or he was a technocrat and they thought he would be sort of harmless. I've heard all the stories. I still don't believe I really understand what happened, but that was the turning point. The interesting thing is that Putin has built a very personalized dictatorship, a very personalized autocracy. And you can see that this one person had an enormous ability to roll back the things that Yeltsin stood for, to bolster the security services so they could roll them back, to make choices. And by the way, he didn't let us know about this right away. I think Yevgenia and I have some rather sharp criticisms of what a former KGB officer would be like. But if you go back and look on the record, in the first years of Putin's presidency, there's a lot of statements about the importance of free markets and even of democracy. And I asked Yevgenia earlier, I said, this raises an interesting historical question. When he said that, was he lying, or did he become more authoritarian late? When he said in 2004, I will guarantee the future of Russian democracy, was that just a total erranda? Was that
Yeah, but he put
Pokazuka?
Khodorkovsky before then in jail.
Yes, he put Khodorkovsky in jail. So we don't really know all the answers to these turning points yet, but the big one was Yeltsin picked the wrong person who took Russia backwards. Putin had never experienced the great blossoming of the 1980s. He missed perestroika and glasnost. He had no idea and probably no sympathy for anything about the creation of a new Russia that we hold so dear. That is the simple, basic reason this happened. And I think probably all of the scholars in this room will write papers about some more of the reasons, and I'll happily read them. I don't have them all myself. I would add one other thing. I admire Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin for many, many things. And one thing that I think he completely failed at was building a rule of law state. Yeltsin understood the power of destroying the Communist Party and destroying the old system. He put people in place. He didn't quite understand it, but he put people in place who understood the power of market capitalism. And he got part of the way with market capitalism. But he never understood about the need to build a new system of rule of law, which is absolutely essential for democracy. Civil society began to take off in his time, maybe because he left it alone. Yeltsin never closed a news organization. But rule of law was complete failure. And I think that looking back at it, things could have been different if he had been more of a builder. Yeltsin tore things down, and that was good at the time, but the need in the 90s to build a rule of law state might have created institutions and a system that Vladimir Putin couldn't have so easily diverted to what it's become.
Let me make it a little bit more difficult for you.
Oh, come on. I take my day off.
The first 8 years of Putin's rule, he was sort of, beloved man of the West. So many stories were written that, Russia is such an unruling country, such an unlawful country. It needs, the strong hand. And he was time and again, not just Europe, but in the United States as well, Many, there were a lot of stories, that, Putin did this and Putin did that. And, yes, he's a little bit, going into this authoritarian politics, but probably that's what is needed. That's what, and look, he successfully bought half of European politicians. Just think about this, David. The former Chancellor of Germany, the former President of Finland, the former Prime Minister of French Republic, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria, and so it goes. All of them, they were sitting on the boards of the Russian most lucrative corporations. They were receiving, hundreds of thousands of dollars yearly, and they were Putin's puppets, at least in Europe, right? He tried to do it, with one of the vice presidents here in the United States. He failed, it's true. But still, West embraced Putin.
You're missing something, Virginia. I think you're right, but you're missing the cause. You're seeing the symptoms. The cause is there was a major increase in oil prices between 2000 and 2008. Putin was floating in oil money. And in fact, this had two benefits for him. One was at home, living standards rose quite significantly, and a new generation of young people, many of whom had maybe been born in late Soviet times, but were just growing up in those years, they were actually very enthusiastic about Putin. You know, you could go to coffee houses and hear young people talk enthusiastically because the values of their paychecks were going up. Westernization was going on everywhere. People could travel freely.
Change for freedom.
And Putin made a deal in those years with people. It's what our colleague Masha Littman called the non-participation pact. It was an informal agreement that if the Russian people would just stay out of politics, he would stay out of the kitchen. In other words, you could say whatever you like in private, just don't get involved in public politics. He would deliver rising living standards, more money, and you can have your personal freedom. People bought that deal, and it lasted until 2011. It fell apart one day in the Luzhniki Stadium. I was live on Echo Moskvy on the moment that it fell apart with Alexei Venediktov, and it completely collapsed because Putin and Medvedev announced at a rally that they were going to switch jobs arbitrarily. And the Russian voters and people that had been sort of at least agreed not to participate suddenly said, wait a minute, aren't we like supposed to vote? I mean, aren't we supposed to choose? What do you mean you're switching? And that just triggered a huge outpouring. It broke the non-participation pact in September of 2011. And it was one of the big mistakes that's led to where we are today. But so the oil money gave him lots of resources, build up the security services, buy off the foreign politicians, do better, try and convince the West that he was a normal guy, but also at home. Things were relatively quiescent. You have to admit, people bought the non-participation pact for a while.
Yeah, but the reason why there were so many startups and Russian economy was doing so well, and there were so many new businesses because the West opened capital markets to Russians. Money were extremely expensive inside Russia, but in 2007, 2008, when Putin was already putting people in jails for their political participation, who was already, he was already creating a hell of a lot of problems to all democratic parties and people like Nemtsov. You opened him capital markets, and you open them technological markets, which allowed Putin to rebuild military industrial complex.
But Yevgenia, money does not have a political soul. Doesn't care. It doesn't
I know.
care.
Right.
Money only goes where it thinks there's more money.
But you don't want to say that the West was short-sighted with respect to Putin. That you sort of, that this idea that Russia, a so unlawful country, that we better have, some strong man who's running it, was sort of, embraced by, look, Bush, by the way, managed to see soul in this KGB guy.
I know. Look, I'm not disagreeing. I think there's some truth to what you say. There's no question. But I don't think it's the only part of this. By 2007 in the Munich conference, it was pretty clear. And I personally, like you, have been kind of a critic of Putin all those years, and things like Beslan. I mean, we saw those clearly. I think it's just too simplistic to say, oh, it's all the fault of the West. We gave them.
No, I don't say this. I just think that it's a very important variable. Before we go, probably we should go into, I should ask you about, this the war, and then I can ask you about, your other books. Tell me, because since we're talking about Putin, what is your understanding? How did Putin made did go into this, this decision to go into war? What is your understanding? What did happen? Here, according to fabulous Mark Saddams of Financial Times piece, Lavrov said that there were three advisors. The Putin had three advisors: Catherine the Great, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great.
Right.
So all those who, three czars who acquired land for the Russian Empire and turned Russia into the empire. Tell me, what, from your perspective, why did he go into this war that is going to destroy, which is of course going to destroy Ukraine, but it's also is going to destroy Russia, its economy, everything?
If I really knew the answer,
Right. of
I'd be
course.
writing the book this minute. Puzzled over this question a lot. It's one we should discuss and think about a lot. To me, I always saw Russia, and I wrote the Oligarch's book and in my travels there and reporting there, as essentially a clan structure. I always thought that Putin was the Don, but that the clans of Russia, the Siloviki, the oligarchs, the technocrats, that this was essentially a balancing act between competing clans. And certainly in the 90s, the clan structure fit pretty well. But maybe I was wrong, because I thought when the tanks were rolling up to the border of Ukraine, and my colleagues at the Post said, will there be an invasion? I actually wasn't all that sure, because I thought certainly the counterweight of the oligarchs or the Siloviki or the military, something will pull him back. That because he's a balancer, there's going to be forced. And I was completely wrong, because essentially Putin ordered this war on his own. And you tell me, how does one guy, even Vladimir Putin, manage to mobilize an entire country for, I'm talking about a war that had no apparent support popularly, had no apparent support militarily, no apparent support in the Siloviki. I can't find, there were not people marching in the street for war. There were no pretext for war. There was no reason for war. How does one person take a huge country like Russia and throw it into such a senseless and destructive moment? I still can't answer that. I thought for sure some oligarchs or Siloviki or military would basically stop this, or at least even in the first weeks. And here we are, Ukraine under such terrible destructive pressure. And it still goes on. And I still think we're going to wake up one morning, or I pray that we wake up one morning and somebody will come to their senses. This would lead to another question. Why didn't the oligarchs do it? Why didn't the Siloviki do it? Why didn't the military do it? And I think, again, we need to understand more. I hate to say it, but Evan Gershkovich was one of the last Western correspondents remaining in Moscow. My newspaper has pulled people out for their safety. The New York Times has pulled most of its people out for their safety. Other organizations have fled too. When the law says that a simple word you utter can be a cause for criminal prosecution, it's not really easy to stick around even with your press card. But as a result, we have even less information from the ground in Russia than we used to. I wish we understood more about each of these institutions, and also about public attitudes. Yevgenia Kara-Murza said yesterday an interesting thing. I asked her about this in a session we had at the Washington Post. I pointed out to her that there's been a great deal of passivity, and there are not Russians carrying placards saying "Free Vladimir Kara-Murza." They used to demonstrate for Navalny because he had a big organization, but there are no Navalny demonstrations either. And why is that? And she pointed out to me, this is a society that's hurt. It's not healthy. All the last independent television was closed down in 2003. For years, they've been subject to this essentially state-sponsored propaganda, and that it's not possible with fear in the air, with people being arrested. So with that little child's drawing leading to an arrest, people are scared. That's why. But so we have a passive and fearful society, and that we have to look at that question too. Why people are not in the streets for the senseless war.
As opposed, by the way, to Ukraine, which had this vibrant society, sweet state, and very vibrant society. And that's what I think, from my perspective, that's why there is such an amazing resistance and resilience on part of Ukrainians. You wrote, the book about the Cold War arms race. Would you expect Putin to use nukes? We discussed this with Marta Guess, in one of those videos.
I did write a book about nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I do not expect him. I do expect him to continue to threaten to use them And the threat itself is not inconsequential. Throughout the entire nuclear age, there was a realization of the enormous destructive power of a nuclear weapon. You know, people don't maybe understand this, that when a bomb goes off, a normal bomb, there's a chemical reaction in the fire, and it's called a chemical fire. But when a nuclear bomb goes off, there's a different kind of reaction. It's not chemical, it's a fission reaction that is 1,000,000 times more intense than the chemical fire of a conventional bomb. So realizing this after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world entered a period of decades in which using nuclear weapons was taboo. And in fact, none were used in combat yet. And that taboo was kind of an important thing, that people didn't talk about using them. Sure, we built a lot of them in the Cold War silently, and we had this mutual assured destruction and deterrence and all of that, but we didn't go about making threats to use them, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Vladimir Putin has already broken that taboo completely in just the last year. I don't think that's a small thing. I don't think he'll do it for the following reasons. There's absolutely no military gain to be had from it. These are political weapons. They're not military weapons. They will get you nothing militarily. And frankly, they'll get you nothing politically either, because if you incinerate a whole city, they're not going to be your followers when you occupy it. Furthermore, it would isolate Putin totally from the rest of the world. I think China, India, others would be abhor nuclear use. You lose all your friends. And I think it's also possible it would cause a major NATO reaction, a conventional reaction that Putin doesn't want. I mean, using a nuclear weapon would have to be met immediately by some kind of military action that would essentially bring down his regime. There are lots of reasons leaning against it, but I remind you that I was wrong about the war. So I hope I'm right about this.
The $1 Billion Spy. It's an amazing book. If you haven't read it yet, go buy, because it's amazing. It's a thriller, but it's a documentary thriller. Tell me, from what I understand and from what you write in this book, you got access to the dossier that CIA gave you on this famous case. Tell me, how did you get, first of all, did you work for the CIA ever? No, good, thank you. Just in case. How did you get these papers?
So the book is about a single espionage operation in Moscow in the 1980s. And it's about one man, Adolf Tolkachov, who was a designer in a top secret bureau in Moscow, designing air defense radars on the ground that would allow the Soviet Union to see a possible invading forces, and radars in the air that would allow them to fight offensively. And this particular man, Tolkachov, was fed up with the Soviet system. He was fed up because he and his wife had lost relatives in Stalin's purges. The promise of the thaw, they felt, had been unrealized. The Goda Zastoy made them even more restless. Things weren't changing. All of their hopes and dreams weren't coming about, and he decided to strike back by basically delivering to the Central Intelligence Agency all the top military secrets in his drawer at the Military Institute. So this is the story of how the CIA ran the operation. I had found out about it in my earlier book, The Dead Hand, and I knew a gentleman who had been involved with some of it. And I approached the CIA and I asked, I said, I'd like to write a book about it. And they said, well, we might help you. So I said, look, let's have an arrangement where if you can find all the files, we'll have one of your guys go through them, make sure they're not anything sensitive, and then you give them to me and I'll be free to use them from the outside. It wasn't Freedom of Information Act. It was called basically unilateral declassification. I sent a request asking for the documents. They had their chance. They actually had two chances. They did find the documents and they went through the whole thing and took out and redacted all the things they thought were sensitive. So I gave them a shot. But then when they gave me the records, 944 pages of documents from this operation, I then had to go build the story. And of course, a lot of things were redacted, including, for example, the CIA had given Kolkachev a camera. It was a Pentax. They crossed out the word Pentax. I said, this is a brand name. There's like only 6 million of them around the world. And they said, no, we couldn't. Anyway, I figured it out. But so to write the book, I had to get the documents. It took 3 years. Once I got them, it took 3 more years to find the people to figure out what they had redacted and put the story together. So the book overall took almost 6 years. That's how I did it. They gave me the records, they cut them out, and then I went around and re-reported it.
Okay, amazing. Now, tell me about this Cuba book.
Okay, I know you want to ask questions. but
Yeah, and then, I'm
in
supposed.
5 minutes, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So I got interested in everything that Jenny and I have lived through. What makes a free Russia or a new country free after a period of totalitarianism? What kinds of people do it? Adolf Kolkachev and the spy, he stood up to the system in his way. And while I was writing editorials at the Post, I was pretty new at it. There was a car wreck in Cuba, and the news came out that a dissident had died in the car wreck. And I got assigned to write more about it, and I did. And it led to this book, which is about a fellow named Oswaldo Payá. Payá was sort of the Sakharov of Cuba. For many years, he was trying to defend democracy and the rights of people to choose their own leaders in Fidel Castro's dictatorship. And in so doing, he was often harassed and punished, and he kept at it. And he eventually started a really amazing, innocent method to fight back, a citizen petition. He had nothing more than a pencil and paper and a petition demanding 5 rights: free press, free association, free enterprise, freedom of political prisoners. Very simple thing. And he went door to door all over Cuba. And he said to people, this is legal. There was a long forgotten provision in the Cuban Constitution that said people can petition their government and the petitions should be honored by the National Assembly. And a funny thing happened. I mean, Cuba was every bit as totalitarian a system as the Soviet one at certain times. There were big jails full of political prisoners. Castro controlled all the major things that count in a totalitarian society: the press, the economy, the political system. There was no room at all. And in that environment, Oswaldo Payá, in between 96 and 2002, got 35,000 people to sign that petition with their real names, with their addresses, and their ID numbers. They stood up to be counted. He had no iPhone, no internet. He had no other way than actually personally talking to people, oftentimes groups of 3 or 4 in the living room. And people were hungry for this message. They were hungry to know that it was possible to ask for democracy. It was possible to stand up to that totalitarian wall and to make the demands like Sakharov had. And there was just, finally, Oswaldo Payá and his guys working with him, he was Roman Catholic, and he had very strong views that the rights of people are bestowed on us at birth by God, that they're not rights that are given to us by dictators and by Fidel Castro. This notion really resonated. People wanted to take their rights to themselves. 35,000 people signed. Oswaldo Payá submitted 11,020 signatures in May of 2002, 21 years ago. It was a thrilling moment for everybody that was behind this experiment, and Castro basically put them in the trash can. Payá won the Sakharov Award that year for human rights, and a year later, not quite, 11 months later, Castro decided to start arresting everybody. All of his people that had worked on this project with the petition were arrested. Some of them were given prison sentences of 26 years, like Vladimir Kara-Murza. Many families were broken. Payá was not arrested. Psychological torture, he was left unharmed. He had a bag by his front door, ready to go to jail any minute, but they arrested all of his people and gave them long prison sentences, completely arbitrarily. He was devastated. It was called the Black Spring in 2003. And he continued to fight, just like Kara-Murza and like Sakharov. He continued. Obviously, he tried to raise money to help the families of all these people. They were all men. There was one woman, she was later let out, but there's 74 men and their wives began to demonstrate for freedom. They became known as the ladies in white because they appeared every Sunday on the streets of Havana in white with lilies and also with pencils, symbolic of this pencil and paper that had been used. And the ladies in white became a big separate organization, but it grew out of what Oswaldo had done. The thing kept going. People didn't forget. Paya, when in the very beginning had said he wanted to call his organization, he was going to create a movement. He wanted to call it Solidarity. But Lech Walesa had been a big source of his inspiration. And then he said, I want to call it Liberation. And he held up his hand like this for liberation. In the end, his pals convinced him to make a bigger name, and they called it the Christian Liberation Movement. And yet this simple L for liberation is today held up on the streets of Cuba all the time. People still remember that this guy stood up for it and what he stood for. In 2012, his car he was riding on was run off the road by Cuban state agents and he was killed. That's the spoiler. Anyway, if you're interested in democracy, Cuba, or if you're interested in the whole idea of courage, let me recommend it. Advertisement over.
Amazing story. Now we have to turn to the questions. Roman Gerasimov, don't you think such sacrifices as Kara-Murza and Navalny, for that matter, made are doing more bad than good? Don't they play along Putin in a way, creating perfect examples of themselves? They were not afraid, but demonstratively weak. Navalny imprisonment didn't cause any major protests, not even comparable to France's Yellow Jackets, for example. Rephrasing General Patton, quote, instead of going to prison for 25 years, we should make the enemy bastard to do it, end of quote. Wow.
I disagree. Frankly, if it's not Sakharov, if it's not Navalny or Kara-Murza, who's going to stand up to totalitarians? And if we don't stand up, then what will they gobble up next? And when will they be at our door or infiltrating our computer or demanding that we give up some other rights? I'm sorry, somebody has to do it. And it's hard. And these are courageous people. And it is true that there's been a great deal of passivity in Russian society, which we talked about, that people are not marching in the streets, but no wonder, because look how many, 19 or 20,000 people have been detained in the last year in Russia just for being on the street. Okay, it's dangerous. People don't want to risk their whole lives for it, but some do, and thank God for them.
4,400 were sentenced for spreading disinformation, so-called spreading disinformation about the Russian army. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ann Lounsbury from NYU. Two quick questions. Is there a consensus that we're dealing with a quote unquote totalitarian regime? First question. Second question, I'm hearing a lot about the parallels between our period and not only the Cold War period, but actually the Stalin period. Can you talk a little bit about the differences?
If you take the Friedrich and Brzezinski definition of totalitarian society, I highly recommend that book. It's from 1956, but it holds up pretty well. They say there are 5 pillars, and I think by that measure, current system is totalitarian. And the word was actually invented in Italy in Mussolini's time, and Mussolini liked it and he adopted it willingly, but it was meant to be criticism. But they argued that totalitarian system closes off all independent activity, whether in the press, in the control of state power, in politics, and in the economy, and in cultural affairs. And if you read that simple chapter and apply it to what Putin's done today, there is no room left. If you had asked me, was Russia in 2008 totalitarian? I would say no. I would have said it was soft authoritarian. This last period has been far more draconian and severe than some of the earlier periods. So it's changed, but it's pretty bad now. And I would defer to you, Yevgenia, about whether it's really as bad as Stalin's time, because we aren't seeing mass
It's
executions.
impossible to compare.
It's impossible.
No, it's not even as bad as it was in Brezhnev's time. It was much worse back then. I would say that, to be honest with you, I would argue, because there are a lot of students from my class, the totalitarian system requires ideology.
That was
There
one
is
of the
no
5
ideology.
pillars.
Do you know?
That's
Do you-
one of the 5 pillars.
Yes, by the way, and that's what Brzezinski points out. There is no ideology. There are no ideology whatsoever. And Putinism is not ideology. Listen, there's what ideas.
It's true, but there is high-level personalization.
Anyway, okay. Any, yes, please. Okay, we will start from, yes, please.
Hi, I wanted to go back to what we talked about at the start of the interview. Like, I saw in the video and the news that Evan got a 25-year sentence.
No,
There was a-
Evan's not been sentenced. Kara-Murza's been
Oh,
sentenced.
yes, and there was a press conference with him locked up in like a see-through cell.
Right.
And then with all this publicity, it almost looked like a statement that the Russian government is trying to make. And then you mentioned that perhaps it's like their bargaining chip. But then I can't help but to draw lines between that scene and what you mentioned in your book, The $1 Billion Spy. You wrote in your book, and this is the first sentence, the spy had vanished. And later on, you continue and said, no one in the CIA knew why the spy had disappeared. And there's like a contrast between the scene that I saw in the news and what was portrayed in the book. And I was wondering, why do you think that there was a change in the style of Russia's execution in like matters related to what we mentioned?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know how to answer your question because I don't quite understand the context that you see. That book is about a 1980s man, a Soviet research scientist who was fed up with the system and decided to basically become a spy for the United States. This is about a legitimate, honest journalist doing his job, following the rules with the card that Russia had given him, wrongly accused of treason, wrongly accused of spying. The two things are not related. One was a spy, one isn't.
Pedro Pisana.
You have more back there. You want to do, okay, you're gonna
Yes,
rotate.
well, I'm going to rotate. Yes, that's what we do. Pedro Pisana, he's of McCain Institute, fantastic discussion, blah, blah. Why hasn't or should the US Secretary of State declare Kara-Murza wrongfully or unlawfully detained per the Levinson Hostage Act that requires to treat him, a green card holder, as a US national?
So he's right. I actually read the law again yesterday. So Vladimir Kara-Murza clearly qualifies under the law for this designation. This the law says that a permanent resident was a significant presence in the United States. Kara-Murza has that, his family lives here, and they're American citizens, can be designated. The designation is not an all-purpose instant answer here. It just moves the jurisdiction of the particular case from essentially one government agency to another government office that's explicitly charged with negotiating for an exchange. So it helps. It should be done. It probably should have been done sooner. And I personally think it's going to be done. And I can't think of any reason not to do it. But I again think we should keep expectations in check. This is not as simple as, a bureaucratic move in our system. It's
So I
much
assume, David, you think that Putin is watching us as we speak, or his people?
Of course.
Of course. Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, thanks for the lovely talk. It was great. Dimitri from University College London. You mentioned Belarus, you sort of alluded to Belarus briefly in your talk. And just looking at Belarus now, there are over 1,400 political prisoners there, and known some of them are journalists. So you're thinking, have you thought of some sort of authoritarian learning between the two regimes? Certain things that happened in Belarus before were played out in Russia later. Is that a pattern or am I just imagining?
Oh, no, quite to the contrary. I believe, and I've been studying this more closely lately. This is extremely important. It's probably the most important thing we've talked about today. There's not only authoritarian learning between these regimes, there is between all of them. And we are entering, I hate to say another Cold War because the history doesn't repeat itself. We are entering another really difficult time in world affairs. It's coming up and it's kind of looming on the horizon. Two enormous superpowers have become, within the last 10 years, very suddenly darker and more authoritarian and totalitarian, and they want to rule the world. They are not content to just have it at home. Both Russia and China are using the same methods, and they're sharing them. And they're sharing them with smaller countries, Belarus and Cuba, Venezuela, Burma, Cambodia. Just look around. Authoritarian learning is going on across all of these countries, even places like Egypt and Turkey. You see some of these techniques just sliding from one to the other, delegitimizing NGOs as foreign agents, attacking journalists for no reason. And so this is really what we face as the American people and our allies and people that care about these values are faced with something big that we just didn't expect. Russia 15, 20 years ago was not going to be our enemy, and China was going to make more and more goods. They were the world's factory floor. What happened? Things are really different all of a sudden, and they are talking about how to exploit open societies, how to wreck democracies, how to infiltrate them. The police just yesterday arrested and charged a bunch of people with setting up a Chinese secret police station here in New York City.
In Manhattan.
To go around and harass Chinese people. And I know one case how they've done that. Can you imagine? I mean, if they get away with this, they'll be doing that too. We have a big problem. And these methods are not only, to be honest with you, people don't get this idea. They see Kara-Murza and Navalny and they think dissidents is just some heroic, thing that they make statues for. But in Belarus, there's a young woman, her name is Danuta, and she was on a languages program at a provincial university in Belarus, Mogilov State University. She was studying ancient languages, and she was on a bus on the way to work, and her boyfriend sent her a telegram message early in the war, the first days, saying, gee, we really ought to be against this war. It's terrible what they're doing to Ukraine. And she reposted it on a Telegram channel or like a chat room, right? Not even a channel. The next day, when she got off the bus, she was arrested for that single post. Danuta was tried and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. She is 20 years old for a single repost. Then they discovered that maybe they had made a mistake in the trial and they had it again. In a closed trial, she was again sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. So this kind of authoritarian sharing is not only Kara-Murza's speeches, but it's also a lot of people, thousands of people around the world, young people, the generation of those in this room are being imprisoned for social media posts. That is part of the authoritarian sharing that's going around. Simple tweets, people are going to jail every day. And if you want to learn more about this, I wrote a big article about it in the Washington Post 2 months ago, and you can find it. It's an editorial, and we have 25 profiles of people, and I urge you to take a look at it. It's very, very scary.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Julia, going back to where we started with Gershkovich, you say he's a journalist, he was following all the rules, but he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he played into hostage diplomacy. Where does that leave?
Well, not hostage diplomacy, hostage taking.
Hostage taking, yeah. Where, for the purposes of trading it for Russia. Where does that leave American journalists still in Russia? And then more broadly, what sort of guidelines should newsrooms be giving out for correspondents who are going to go to a country where now there's a chance that they could be snatched off the street because it's conducive to local politics?
Look, it's a very good question, and I was a foreign editor of the Post for a while and thought about this a lot. First of all, it makes it more dangerous. The message is to all correspondents there to be careful and to watch their back. It definitely raises the ante. You know, imagine we're in a world where a really big country has suddenly changed the rules, saying we can do whatever we want. No more actually having press cards in which we both sides honor it. By the way, the intelligence services have the same arrangement. You know, they don't basically shoot each other; they just kick each other out. Right? For years, the KGB and CIA had the same arrangement. You get caught, you get kicked out. You don't get executed. The spy, the national will get executed. But the point is that these rules are how governments operate. And when Russia completely changes them, we have to recognize this danger is going up. It does not necessarily follow that you should immediately stop reporting. And I have advised reporters who have done very dangerous things for many years about how to do it, what to do and what not to do. It's tricky. There are no simple answers here. But as journalists, we have an obligation to try and get at the truth no matter where it is. And I've talked to reporters gone to war. I've sat up all night worrying about them at war. I've seen them ripped apart by the dangers of that. And this is no different than war. It may not be bullets, but it could be lots of other dangers. We will still go because that is the only way we, in an open society, earn the trust of people that come to us. There's no way we can abandon the news altogether. And it's hard. Papers are now building bureaus around the edges of Russia to try and cover. We have a bureau in Riga trying valiantly every day to get the truth, calling people. Frankly, we have the same problem in China. Both the New York Times and the Washington Post have had incredible difficulty getting back into China after COVID. You know, there are no Post or Times reporters on the ground. There's one New York Times guy who's been in China for a long time, but we have the same issue. We're calling or watching Telegram or Weibo or something instead of being on the ground. And I personally have raised this with the Chinese and said, you know, you have a lot of people in our open society. And by the way, Russia does too, right? Sputnik and RT have whole throngs of people in Washington, D.C. There's no easy symmetry in the rules of the world right now. It's actually quite unsettled. And how are we going to survive? How are we going to defend our values? How are we going to do reporting? These are all really big, hard things that we're confronting right now in our time.
Katie Duda, with specifically accusations of espionage and convictions of treason, is this an attempt to mobilize the attitude of the Russian state being under threat?
Maybe, but it's also, is the Russian state under threat from Evan? I don't think so. I mean, it goes back to, it reflects weakness, right? For Putin's spokesman to say he was caught red-handed says a lot more to me about the state of the Kremlin thinking than it does about spying. No one believes it, and they actually say things like this. They're kind of laughing stock. You know, Lavrov said something recently about Ukraine to an audience. People started laughing in the audience. And I mean, I think actually the Russian weakness is on display here. And these are desperate acts by people that are desperate.
Yes, please, Josh.
So I'm Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center, professor of politics there. So thanks so much for being here today. I wanted to just follow up on the question before and pick up on what you were saying before about Evan being taken because he's, you know, wrong place, wrong time. I would love to hear your insight into how the logistics of this you think plays out, right? So is this from the top down, we are going to grab a reporter, right? And the word goes out, and then it's just the first person to grab a reporter? Is it a much more informal thing where lower level officials think I can curry favor by doing this, and this just happened to be, or is there like a new edict, and as soon as we find foreign reporters who are doing X, grab them, right? Like, so what's this, do you have it? I mean, and I know I'm asking a lot here, but like, I'm just trying to understand how this system plays out here. Because as you said, this does seem like a rather big step here to imprison a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, right? And arrest them on espionage charges. So I'd be very interested in any insights you have about like the process by which these kind of incremental steps in this direction proceed.
I hate to disappoint you, but I'm gonna disappoint you. I don't know.
I don't know either, which is why I tried to ask you.
I would surmise that this had Putin's approval, that somebody said, we gotta grab somebody, and it's quite possible, given the very few correspondents left in Moscow, that on the day they decided to do this, they had a guy who's not in Moscow, who's out traveling. They knew he worked for a major American news organization. Again, I don't think they wanted a British. So there weren't very many Americans, maybe, and they went for somebody who was
All right, so you don't think this was like, I mean, because a lot of times, like with academics and stuff like that, people get out of the regions, and overzealous regional officials arrest somebody in an archive, and and the next thing you know, you have an incident on your hand, and of course the Russians don't back down, but you don't know if they wish it hadn't happened.
I don't think that was this kind
You
of
don't think
case.
this-
I know
this
those
was-
cases,
Yeah,
but I don't think so.
okay.
I think this was a sort of a rash and desperate move at the first, and he was a target. And when Brittany Griner was traded, I said, this puts a crosshairs on the back of Americans in Moscow. And unfortunately it did.
You think it was a wrong decision to trade?
It was very, very difficult decision because obviously there was a humanitarian reason to make the trade. She was innocent, and so, but the fact is that
Just imagine in the racist country which Russia is, to have a black woman in the Russian prison who didn't speak any Russian.
Right. But
I
just
mean,
imagine
you
what
couldn't do
Putin
anything.
thought when we gave him Victor Boot back.
But
When we gave him someone who like that, prized reward for the trade, for someone who had done nothing. Imagine, I mean, it must have been just days before they had the planning meeting for the next hostage. I don't like this business of trading,
Can I ask
and
you
I
one-
don't think it's an easy way out for us.
Just to push you on one more thing, and difficult questions, Jen would answer the first one. Well, you mentioned RT and Sputnik, right? And one thing we know, right, from espionage in Cold War days, you snatch one of ours, great, we'll grab one of yours and kick them out of the country. We've seen these kind of
Diplomats.
retaliation, right, with diplomats. So do you think as a journalist that there should be that sort of model? You're gonna grab one of our, as you said, there's asymmetry right now. The guy had a press card, he's grabbed off the streets, now he's being espionage. Do you think there should be, that RT or Sputnik people, not that they should be arrested, but like there should be some sort of pushback against the operating of these systems? Or as a journalist, do you think, no, we're gonna go the high road, we're gonna model what an open society looks like, regardless of what's happening to our people over there?
As hard as it is to answer, I believe that we should not get in the mud with pigs. I believe that no matter how difficult, we are an open society with confidence in our values. We should not do things against those values. And this was arbitrary arrest. We should not engage in that. What we tend to forget is the power of our open society. We should use the tools that we have, the powers that we have. I would be all in favor of trying to swamp every possible channel available to reach the Russian people, to tell them that this was a hostage taking, and to make them understand the real story. That information and the ability to show them what's really going on, that's part of our sort of superpower. I'm not sure we do that very well, and it worries me, but I think ultimately also I feel with China, a lot of people said we were naive by saying we will model an open society. We invite you all, to come and see what it's like, and not doing anything. And the Chinese tried to exploit that. They did, but we shouldn't try and replicate what they do. I think that's wrong.
yes, please.
Yes, Yulia Milchenko, David had an exchange with Yevgenia where to the question of the role of foreign capital in Russia, you effectively replied that the money doesn't care.
As said, had no soul.
Has no soul.
Yeah, I guess it doesn't care.
So that's a really dark answer. And then I kind of realized that actually totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, eventually they're the more inefficient economic systems. So if we are talking about superpower competition between China, Russia, and the rest of the world, we should know what the answer will be, which is the less efficient economic system will eventually lose. And our system, open society system, will survive. So is it how we should think about it, or is there a third way?
The theory you just described is correct, but the practice is not so clear cut, because totalitarian systems, centrally planned systems, militarized systems have certain resilience and elasticity that is not simple. It can go on for a long time. I mean, I think that as an open society, we've learned that we have to stop plug the loopholes that allow those others to exploit us. I was thinking particularly of Burma, horrific bombing now of civilians in Burma. We have to cut off their supply of jet fuel and ground them. And this is a case where they get their jet fuel no longer from us, but they get it from Russia and China. And that fuel is leading to hundreds of deaths of civilians as this military. So again, it comes in, we can't wait forever for that military to go belly up because they couldn't run their economy. They could suck off of Russia and China for a long time. So it's more complex. They can be more resilient.
Sasha, we salute. Don't you think the missing ideology is starting to form around the ideas of the West as the enemy, and the usurping of World War II, as in we made it to Berlin and we will repeat it if necessary?
I don't think so. I don't think the American people are ready for that yet.
I think even she's talking about, the ideology in Russia.
I don't know. If it was really true that Russians were turning very anti-Western and really were subscribing to some kind of ideology, some do, there's no question. But here's an interesting fact that Yevgenia Kara-Murza mentioned yesterday. Russia ranks second in the world in the penetration of virtual private networks. Millions of Russians want honest, clear information, and they're using these software methods to get outside and see what's going on. And I'll tell you, maybe this is self-selecting, but Russians that I've met and known over the years, even through these hard times, haven't adopted any kind of anti-Western ideology. So I think it's not necessarily working. I know they're trying to sell it, but I don't see it actually seizing people, except for some. I mean, we have to admit that Putin commands a certain chunk of Russian society, but it's not the whole. And that's really where the game is going to be played. Those people who are passive, but are not really in favor of destroying Ukraine, and actually are interested in going to Paris for a holiday and would like to actually think about a normal country again. There's a lot of that part of the Russian population.
Last question. Yes, please, Rita.
Well, first, thanks to the both for the beautiful conversation. It's just it's a pleasure and honor to have an opportunity to discuss this awful case of Vladimir Kara-Murza. I appreciate that much. My question is to David. I really like your idea about this non-participation pact you said, of early Putin times. And I'm pretty much with you, but if we take it as a social contract, I disagree on the date of this termination and certain level. I think it just, 11 years, said it's different for different people. It can be unfair elections, Crimea, the propaganda law, memorial, 2021, and I mean, you name it. And I was just wondering, do you think this contract is over for all now, which is pretty much evident, I think? And then what's a new contract? Or is it just fear?
Well, you've answered your own questions completely. I agree with you. It's different for everybody.
Yeah.
But I do think it's over and done. And I don't think anything's replaced it, which is another reason why Putin must feel his situation is a little tenuous. He hasn't replaced it with anti-Westernism or with his personality. He hasn't. And I do agree with you that lots of different reasons caused it, not only the election one. In my mind, it was that huge uproar. It was Bolotnaya. It was Rusibia's Putina. You know, it was that moment in time when people really didn't fear to say Russia without Putin. But sure, it could have started sooner and gone on longer. And now there's nothing. Putin's flying blind.
Thank you so much. Let's thank you to. Thank you very much, David. It was,
My pleasure.
it was
Thank you all for the conversation.
Great, thank you.
And David special came all the way from Washington DC, 3 hours by train.
Day off.
Day off. And he's going back to Washington DC because tomorrow there will be a huge rally in support of Vladimir Kara-Murza.